Thanks very much for that very kind introduction. What an honour to be here at the Kerala Literature Festival. It's my first time, and it's an extraordinary festival. I didn't imagine that it would be the biggest festival I've ever seen, and I've heard some wonderful papers today, some wonderful presentations. What a great selection of writers, and multilingual as well. So I was in Delhi yesterday and the day before, and attended the Hyman Tomb Museum, where the museum and the Australian High Commission, in conjunction with the National Museum of Australia, have exhibited incredible artworks from Australia called songlines. The exhibition includes paintings, sculptures, videos, including interviews with the artists, and it represents the interconnections between very remote Aboriginal peoples across the central and western deserts of Australia. And the title Songlines refers to the very long ancestral pathway that links all of these artists across a 2,000-kilometre expanse. The term songlines is an English term that doesn't really capture what the artists are celebrating, because it was invented by an English travelogue writer, Bruce Chatwin, who wrote the book when he visited Alice Springs fairly briefly. But the word has come into the English language as as almost a technical term, which it isn't. But in any case, from the eastern side of the Northern Territory over to the western side of Western Australia, which is about 2,000 or more kilometres, all of the Indigenous groups are linked by an ancestral sacred narrative about the Seven Sisters and Wati Niru, who is the man who chases the Seven Sisters eternally across the sky. The Seven Sisters, of course, are the Pleiades constellation. And the sacred narrative is a series of stories about the Seven Sisters holding each other tight and running from Wati Niru, who chases them and uses his magical powers to entice them. He tries to capture them. He's in love with the youngest one, and the sisters stay together and keep each other safe from him and escape from his attentions until the very end, when they are transformed and go up into the sky as stars, as does he. He's Orion. And so across the night sky every year, this sacred constellation appears, and it tells us about the condition of women and the condition of men in a series of beautiful stories that are represented in the artworks. So this is just one of the sacred narratives that has been held by Aboriginal groups for thousands of years, and which are referred to in English, again, it's a very bad translation, as the dreamings. And so there's a two women dreaming, the two men dreaming, there's a Milky Way dreaming. There are thousands of them, in fact. So now, in the 21st century, there's a great deal of art and literature and music and even film, beautiful films, in which Aboriginal people have produced artworks and literature and so on, and imagery to depict their own world in order to make a very clear statement about their existence and the existence of their ancestors in the face of British colonisation and the anthropologists who came, who depicted Aboriginal people mostly as less than human, and from the beginning declared total sovereignty over various parts of Australia in the stages of colonisation, and eventually total ownership of the land, using the doctrine of terra nullius, which is Latin for easy translation, empty land, but it was a way for the British to deny Aboriginal people any right to self-governance, any right to their property, any rights at all. And so it's the ceded colony thesis from 1832 by Blackstone. The British behave very differently in India, and so you have, all the deals done with the East Indies Company, the arrangements between the Rajas and the British. In Australia, there was nothing like that. In fact, Australia was the only British settler colony without a treaty or arrangement of any kind. For the first time in Australian history, about a month ago, the Victorian state government, which was, of course, originally the second colony in Australia, the colony of Victoria, has now finally, after more than 200 years, legislated a treaty with the Aboriginal people of Victoria. And I tell you all of that history because it's important to understand that little bit by little bit, step by step, Aboriginal people have clawed back land rights and even, as we can see in the statewide Treaty Act in Victoria, rights not quite of self-governance, but at least of a formal relationship with the Parliament to establish and recognise the Aboriginal people as a distinct community in the Victorian society. And this is a very substantial act of recognition after a very brutal colonisation and the dismissal of any Aboriginal rights or any rights for Aboriginal people following federation of the colonies in 1901. So Australia is a very strange British colony in world affairs. Even in New Zealand, the British negotiated a treaty very early on in the 1800s. And the treaty rights remain in force in New Zealand. And in fact, the Waitangi Treaty, or the Treaty of Waitangi, remains one of the foundation documents of New Zealand. New Zealand doesn't have a constitution, and its foundational documents are a series of documents, including the Treaty of Waitangi. So Australia, as the only settler colony with no treaty with the British, therefore has this very strange history of more than 200 years of Aboriginal people arguing for their rights in a peaceful way, and throughout the 20th century and the 21st century, a highly litigious way. there are some very interesting aspects of this. So in the 20th century, in the 1970s, an Aboriginal man, the late Paul Coe, took a case to the High Court arguing for Aboriginal sovereignty. It was the Anthony Mason High Court, and he dismissed the case completely and said there can be no argument with the act of British sovereignty. Basically, Aboriginal sovereignty cannot exist because British sovereignty is supreme. However, since then, a number of Aboriginal people have said, well, that's wrong for a number of reasons. One, comparing Aboriginal sovereignty to the idea of British sovereignty, you know, the Westphalian concept of a nation with a territorial boundary that can defend itself against all comers, the kind of nation that came out of the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I, when the imperial countries divided up the world. That is nothing like the idea of Aboriginal sovereignty. And it, you know, with respect, this is not what an Aboriginal person should have argued in the High Court. And the idea has developed since then because the Australian government eventually was forced by the High Court to recognise Aboriginal rights in land in the famous Mabo case in 1992. The court said, well, terra nullius is a legal fiction and it's so contrary to the idea of human rights in the 20th century, we cannot persist with it. And they came to the same conclusion as the Canadian courts in recognising ancient Aboriginal rights in land. So they recognised native title as capable of being proven in court if Aboriginal people could show their connection to the time of annexation, to the time of British annexation, by producing genealogies and histories, and also proving that they maintained a body of Aboriginal laws. And many people have done so, and there are many successful native title cases. But it begs the question, if you can prove that you have a body of land laws, wouldn't you also have a body of laws in relation to other areas of human activity? Well, of course. But they're not recognised in Australia. And this is what is missing from the sovereignty argument. However, in an extraordinary case, an Australian government 3 terms ago tried to deport people who was alleged to be illegal immigrants. However, both of the men, Love and Toms, had Indigenous ancestry and had come to Australia as children because of an Indigenous parent and an Aboriginal parent. The Department of Home Affairs tried by various means to deport them back to New Guinea and New Zealand, and it went to the High Court, and the High Court said they cannot be deported because that would be to breach the spiritual affiliation between an Indigenous person and their home. And so that case, Love and Toms, adds to the story of the growing concept of Indigenous sovereignty as a very fundamental link between Aboriginal people and their territories, land, sea, waters, in the same way that was argued in the Western Sahara case in the International Court. So the Western Sahara people won sovereignty by going to the International Court, and it was on the grounds that it was not just that they were people in possession of a place before colonisation, but also that in a very fundamental way, their identity as a society was tied to their land in a spiritual way. And so our court has effectively found to the same effect in that case of the illegal immigrants. And so this idea of Indigenous sovereignty grows each year in a very organic way based on Aboriginal beliefs rather than on British ideas of sovereignty or European ideas of nation states, which arises out of wars. So what is the consequence of this? The consequence of this is that in so many ways throughout colonisation and since the Federation of the Australian Colonies to make the Commonwealth of Australia in 1901, Australian governments have interfered in Aboriginal life. They've tried to destroy the family by forcibly removing tens of thousands of Aboriginal children. They've removed entire communities and placed Aboriginal people in controlled settlements. They have, until human rights were recognised in Australia for all in about 1975, they denied Aboriginal people the right to own property. Aboriginal people were not allowed to travel without the written permission of a superintendent of the natives. Aboriginal people were not allowed to marry without the written permission of a superintendent of the natives. And those are just a few of the ways in which the states and territories and previously the colonies had tried to, if not eliminate, and in at least two cases we know that they did try to eliminate Aboriginal peoples, and otherwise to control, to establish a system of total control. So by winning back slowly our rights of Indigenous sovereignty, we are able to challenge these severe acts of interference in our family life and in our community life. And the two most important issues relate to the forced removal of Aboriginal children from their families and also the incarceration of Aboriginal men, women and children in prisons and in juvenile justice detention centres, as they're laughingly called. As it stands at the moment, Indigenous Australians, Aboriginal people, are, according to the records, the most incarcerated people in the world. And so tackling these problems of the incarceration rates and the removal of Aboriginal children are very, very high on our agenda, and winning our legal rights to prevent these abuses of human rights are a constant concern. And never a year goes by when Aboriginal people are not in the courts litigating for their rights. But we've made some very big breakthroughs. Another marvellous High Court decision related to the right to compensation for the forced acquisition of Aboriginal rights in land. An Aboriginal group in the Northern Territory, whose land was taken by a mining company in the 1960s, litigated on the right to compensation and won in the High Court. It's to go back to the High Court, but in now two cases in the High Court, the right for Aboriginal people to be compensated for the compulsory acquisition of their land has been secured in Australian law. So bit by bit, we're getting our rights back. And I'm down to my last 10 minutes, and I really would like to leave some time for questions. But I want to say this. There are many books on these matters. I've written a few books on this, on these matters. But I have recently written, along with a group of people from my university, the University of Melbourne, a book on the history of our university in relation to Aboriginal people over the last 170 years. And we asked all of our colleagues to write a chapter telling the truth about the University of Melbourne and its relationship with Indigenous people. And our scholars turned up the most amazing chapters. The 2 volumes are free to download from Melbourne University Publishing. And some of the chapters relate to the early acquisition of the lands of the Wurundjeri people, where our main campus is, and the way in which all of the resources and even Indigenous knowledge were stolen by the university. The cover on volume 1 shows a picture of the white men who claimed all of the knowledge of several Aboriginal men and wrote it up as, for instance, the Northern Tribes of Central Australia by Sir Walter Baldwin Spencer. No. All of the information came from 2 or 3 Aboriginal men. So we have their photos on the front cover. The books are called Dumbak Gub Gawana. You can download them from Melbourne University Publishing for free. And they're a good read because they deal with both the colonial and the post-colonial periods and how we've tried to create a space where it is now safe for everyone, including Aboriginal people, to practice their academic magic at the university in a safe space that is ethical and where our history has been truthfully told so that we no longer live in a colonial lie. So I recommend it to you. And we have now a little time for questions. I'm not sure if the moderator is going to moderate the questions for us. Yes, somebody has a microphone here.
Hi. So you talked about Indigenous sovereignty in Australia, and a couple of years ago Australia signed a treaty with the Pacific nation of Tuvalu. And I've looked it up, the exact wording, and it says, the statehood and sovereignty of Tuvalu will continue and the rights and duties inherent thereto will be maintained notwithstanding the impact of climate change-related sea level rise. That's basically recognising Tuvalu as sovereignty even if it loses its land. So how do you think this is relevant to Indigenous sovereignty challenges in Australia?
When you told me about that today, I was shocked because this is a profound rupture with the normative Westphalian system of sovereignty that's governed the globe since the end of World War I. And I was kind of speechless and thought, I have to think deeply about this. So imagine this. Every nation state in the world pretends that, and most of the time it's true, I suppose, that they exist within secure territorial boundaries and that it was ever thus and ever will be. However, in the Pacific, climate change is radically changing not just the territorial boundaries of the Pacific nation states, the island states, but also threatening their very existence because most of the Coral Cay Islands will completely disappear. Only some islands will be saved by land restoration. And we have already, as you say, the Tuvalu Treaty, which allows Tuvaluans to come to Australia on a ballot system as essentially climate change refugees. So climate change has ruptured the Westphalian concept of sovereignty because in order for such a treaty to be signed, the deal was that their sovereignty, whether or not their territory survives, must continue. And it is an international treaty, and it is now, I presume, international law. Australian law. It's Australian law. It's law. So it's just the most extraordinary development that I can imagine, and of course it will have an impact on Indigenous Australians, especially the Torres Strait Islanders and other island peoples, the Tiwi Islanders, many other people who live on islands, the Croker Islanders, all of whom are affected by climate change. However, we don't have an inherent sovereignty that the Tuvaluans have. But it, as I say, it is being slowly recognised. And I think, if we think deeply about this idea of sovereignty, in the instance of the Tuvaluans, or Tuvalu, in the era of climate change, we can rethink sovereignty. And I think our High Court will be forced to rethink sovereignty. Thank you. Great question.
Hello, thank you for the very interesting talk. I'm just very interested to find out how Indigenous communities themselves resolve conflict, particularly over property within the Indigenous communities, and if we have any lessons to learn from how they resolve disputes, and if there are disputes within Indigenous communities in the land that they had before colonisation.
Apart from one or two apocryphal legends about violent feuds over land, we have never seen violence over Indigenous beliefs about who owns what. There are arguments, and they might go on for a couple of generations or more, over the legitimacy of somebody's claim based on descent, kinship, adherence to law, and so on. So a very senior person might have their right to claim a place as their land because they've inherited it, that it's their right of inheritance that's the subject of the argument, because the inheritance rights are so complex. It isn't simply patrilineal or matrilineal. There are all of these secondary conditions that have to be met. Can he sing all the songs? Can he dance all the dances? Was his grandmother really his wife, the wife of his grandfather? Or was she, did she stay with him for long enough? People will argue about anything, right? So those arguments will go on for 2 or 3 generations, but eventually people will come to accept a claim. So these are arguments about succession. Otherwise, there are a few arguments about territorial boundaries, but really people don't argue about such things except when it comes to putting a claim into a court under the Native Title Act. And then we have overlapping claims. All of our disputes are sorted out in the Australian courts, and there's no violence. It's all... I think Aboriginal people are, apart from tax lawyers, the most litigious people in Australia. And I think we've run out of time. So thank you for that great question. And thank you very much to the audience for coming to hear me. It's wonderful to be here at the Kerala Literature Festival.